There is a piano sitting in the corner of a living room in rural Ohio that nobody has played in 11 years. The woman who played it is gone. Her children don't play. Her grandchildren, who come at Christmas and run their fingers across the keys the way children touch things they don't understand, have no idea what happened in the room that piano sat in, or how many of the family's most important moments happened within 4 feet of where it stands. They don't know about the argument their grandmother had with her own mother the year before she married, conducted in low voices on the bench while the rest of the family pretended not to hear from the kitchen. They don't know about the night their grandfather came home from a long trip and sat down next to his wife at the keys and didn't say a single word, but cried quietly while she played the same hymn twice through. They don't know about the boy who used to come over on Tuesday afternoons for lessons and how he sat on that bench for 2 years through his parents' divorce, and how the piano was the 1 hour every week when nothing about that was happening yet. The piano absorbed all of it. It doesn't speak. It stood in that front room for 63 years and witnessed everything the family passed through, and none of it shows anywhere on its surface except for a few small scratches on the fallboard that nobody can explain anymore. That's what this video is about. Part 1. Why the front room and why the piano? Before television moved the center of the American home from the front room to wherever the screen was largest. The front room, the parlor, the sitting room, the living room that the family actually lived in, was the room where a household performed itself. Not for strangers, for each other. It was the room where guests were received, where important conversations happened, where the family arranged itself on its better behavior and revealed, despite the effort, exactly who it was. The piano was the front room's anchor, not decoratively, though it was that too, in houses that could afford one worth displaying. It was the anchor because it was the activity that drew the room together in the evening, before radio and then television made passive listening the default mode of a family's shared time. Someone played, everyone else sat nearby. For anywhere from 20 minutes to 2 hours, depending on the household's habits and the player's stamina, the family occupied the same room, doing nothing else, with no particular agenda beyond the playing itself. This sounds unremarkable until you consider what it actually meant over the course of a decade or two. A family that gathered nightly around a piano accumulated an enormous number of hours in each other's presence with no task to complete and no distraction to retreat into. Things got said. Things got not said but understood anyway. Moods were legible. Tensions surfaced in who sat where and who left the room early and who requested what song at what particular moment, and a family that paid attention, which most families, navigating their own internal weather, did, learned to read each other in that room in ways that simply don't accumulate when a family is watching television in separate rooms on separate devices. The piano was in the middle of all of it, and it never moved. Part 2. What the keys remembered that the family forgot. There is a specific phenomenon that anyone who grew up in a house with a piano and a consistent player will recognize immediately. Certain pieces of music become permanently indexed to specific emotional states, specific periods, specific events, in a way that almost no other household object manages. The hymn a mother played when she was upset was different from the hymn she played when company was coming. The nocturne a father requested after a difficult week at work was different from the songs he asked for when things were going well. The scales a child practiced on a reluctant Tuesday afternoon carried a completely different energy than the same scales played voluntarily, with genuine interest, 3 months later, and anyone listening from the kitchen could hear the difference without being told. This means that the piano, over years, became a kind of emotional calendar for the household. Specific pieces of music became associated, in the family's collective memory, with specific periods of their lives, not because the music itself carried those meanings, but because it was played repeatedly during the times that were happening. A song a grandmother played constantly the winter her own mother was dying carries that winter inside it, for anyone who was in the room often enough to notice the pattern for the rest of their life. The music doesn't need to be sad, it just needs to have been there. This is a form of memory the front room piano preserved that almost nothing else in the house could. A photograph captures a moment. The piano captured a sustained emotional period, months, sometimes years, in a way that reasserts itself fully every time the same piece is played again. The family that loses a player and never again touches those keys is a family that has quietly sealed off an entire archive of its own emotional history without necessarily knowing that's what happened. Part 3. The piano lesson as a window into everything else. For much of the 20th century, the family piano was not just a household object, but a weekly appointment with a teacher who came to the house, or a child who went to the teacher's house and who sat in that front room for 30 or 45 minutes at a stretch, while the rest of the family found somewhere else to be, or didn't. A piano teacher who gave lessons in a family's home for years accumulated a specific kind of knowledge about that family that very few outsiders ever got. She sat in their front room. She heard what was happening in the kitchen behind her. She watched children arrive at the bench with different energies from week to week, distracted or eager or visibly upset about something they would never mention while sitting at the keys. She saw the furniture change when money got better or worse. She noticed the photographs that appeared and disappeared from the mantel. She registered the specific quality of quiet in a house where something had recently happened, and the different quality of noise in a house where everything was fine. None of this was her business. A professional piano teacher did not comment on the condition of a family's marriage or the reason a child had been crying before the lesson. She sat down, opened the lesson book, and played. But she knew. The same way the woman in the bridal shop knew, because bearing witness and staying quiet were both parts of the same job. And the piano lesson itself, from the other side, from the child sitting at the bench, was often a specific and unusual space inside a household's week. Half an hour where the only task was the music, where the performance anxiety of the lesson, the concentrated focus required to get through a difficult passage, temporarily crowded out whatever else was happening in the house that week. More than one adult who grew up with piano lessons has described the lesson as the most reliably separate hour of their entire childhood. Separate from school, from family tension, from whatever was weighing on the house. The keys required your full attention. Everything else had to wait. That waiting was its own form of relief for a child who needed it. And the piano, which sat in the front room through all of it, never needed to be told. Part 4. The specific weight of who played and who stopped. Every family that had a piano had a player. And almost every family with a player had, at some point, the moment when the playing stopped. And the silence that followed that stopping was rarely just quiet. It was the particular absence of something that had been regular enough to notice, and its disappearance meant something, even when nobody said what. A mother who stopped playing when her youngest left home did not make an announcement about it. She simply didn't sit down at the bench anymore. But the family noticed. Not necessarily in words. Families do not always have words for the things they register most clearly, but in the way a room changes when the thing that anchored it is no longer active. The piano became furniture. The bench got used for stacking things. The keys went unplayed long enough that the action stiffened from disuse and the tuning drifted. And by the time anyone thought to do something about it, it wasn't clear whether anyone was going to play it anyway. When a player died, the silence was different from the silence of stopping. It was immediate and absolute, and it settled into the house in a way that the family often found, for months afterward, genuinely difficult to explain. The piano had been that person's object in a way that a chair or a shelf of books or a set of good dishes could not quite replicate. A chair can be sat in by someone else. A piano, in a family that has lost its primary player, often simply cannot. Attempts to play it feel wrong. Attempts to get rid of it feel worse. So it stays, and the family lives around its particular silence, which is a different kind of silence than any other room in the house produces. There are pianos sitting in front rooms right now, all across the country, that haven't been played in decades, specifically because the person who played them is gone, and nobody knows what to do about that. Not about the piano, about the silence. Part 5. What the piano overheard that nobody meant it to. The front room was the room for important conversations, which meant it was also, inevitably, the room for important conversations that children were not supposed to hear. And the piano was in the front room. A child practicing scales in the front room on a weekday afternoon while her parents talked in the kitchen. The door left open a crack. Voices low, but not low enough, was in a position to hear things that were not intended for her. Not because she was eavesdropping in any deliberate way, but because the piano practice was an assumed activity, a background presence the adults had stopped accounting for, and the scales she was running provided just enough ambient sound to mask the fact that she had stopped playing and was listening instead. Children who grew up in piano houses often recall, with remarkable specificity, information acquired exactly this way: the financial trouble they weren't supposed to know about, the illness that wasn't ready to be announced, the disagreement between parents that was being conducted quietly enough to qualify as not a fight and loudly enough to be completely audible from the piano bench. The piano's presence in the room gave a child a legitimate reason to be there, which is not the same thing as permission to be listening, but it functioned, practically speaking, as cover. The piano overheard things, and the child at the piano overheard them too, which meant that what the front room witnessed and what was preserved in the family's unofficial, unspoken archive sometimes traveled intact through generations, not as a story anyone told, but as a piece of information a child absorbed at the bench and carried silently into adulthood, where it quietly explained things about the family that would otherwise have remained mysterious. Part 6. The economy of the piano and what it cost to keep one. A family piano was not a trivial purchase at any point in the 20th century, and the economics of owning one, maintaining it, and paying for lessons said a great deal about what a household believed was worth spending money on, which is its own kind of window into a family's values and priorities. An upright piano in the 1940s or 1950s cost the equivalent of several months of a working-class salary. Keeping it in tune cost money on a regular basis. Lessons cost money every week for years at a stretch, for each child the family put through them. Families that managed all of this on modest incomes were making a specific, sustained, deliberate choice to keep this object active in their household, a choice that involved real sacrifice, regularly and consistently, and that the children who received those lessons often did not fully understand until they were adults themselves and had some sense of what money actually cost. The piano that got sold when a family fell on hard times left a specific kind of mark, not just the absence of the object itself, but the end of what it represented, the lessons stopping, the evenings changing, a particular version of the household's cultural aspiration quietly set aside until things got better, which in some cases they did, and in others they didn't. A family that sold its piano and never replaced it had crossed a line, even if nobody named the line at the time, and the children who grew up in the house after understood, without being told, that something about the household's possibilities had shifted. And the family that found a piano somehow, even when money was tight, the upright inherited from a grandmother, the instrument purchased second-hand for $30 from a neighbor who was moving, was the family that chose, specifically, to hold on to a version of what the piano meant, even when they couldn't afford what it cost. That choice was its own statement about what this object was for. Part 7. What happened when nobody wanted to play? The front room piano did not survive the 20th century unchanged. By the 1970s and 1980s, it had begun its long retreat from the center of a household's shared life toward the corner of the room it occupies now in most homes that still have one. Decorative, silent, and slightly in the way. Part of this was the rise of recorded music, which gave a family access to professional quality performances without anyone in the household needing to play anything at all. Why sit through a child laboring through a simplified version of a Chopin waltz when you could put on a record and hear the real thing? The logic is understandable. The thing it eliminated, which was not the music but the making of it together, is harder to name and easier to mourn once it's already gone. Part of it was the shifting economics of attention. Piano lessons require a sustained, weekly investment of parental time and money, and a child's sustained, daily investment of practice for years before the results feel rewarding to anyone in the household. Activities with faster visible returns, or that were tied more directly to college admissions or athletic scholarships or other legible future benefits, began competing for the same hours. The piano, which paid off in ways that were real but diffuse and largely internal, lost that competition in a lot of households, starting somewhere around the 1970s and accelerating steadily since. And part of it was simply the fact that as families spread out, as children moved to different cities, as grandparents no longer lived around the corner, as the household itself got smaller and more mobile, the piano's essential characteristic, which was that it stayed in one place for decades and let the family happen around it, became less compatible with the way families actually lived. You cannot carry a piano the way you carry a photograph or a recipe or a story. It requires a room, a stationary room, in a house you're going to stay in long enough for it to matter. Part 8. The things only the piano knew how to keep. There is a category of family history that does not survive in any official record, not in photographs, not in letters, not in anything anyone thought to write down, because it happened in the ordinary, unguarded middle of a weekday evening, in a front room with no one watching who imagined it was worth recording. The piano kept it anyway, not literally. The piano is not a recording device, but the family's relationship with the piano, the specific pieces associated with specific people, the bench that remembers who sat on it, the particular action that one player wore smooth over 30 years of daily practice while the rest of the keys stayed stiffer, is a physical record of sustained presence in a way that almost nothing else in the house can claim. The piano shows, in its physical condition, exactly how it was used and by whom. A keyboard worn at the middle octaves, where a right-handed amateur spends most of her time, tells a different story than one worn evenly across all registers. The handwriting in a lesson book tucked inside the bench. A family sitting in the front room where the piano stands sees a single object that was present for all of them. The grandmother's playing, the lessons, the evenings when everyone gathered, the silence after someone left, and the piano's unchanging presence is itself a kind of through line that photographs and records and even memories cannot quite replicate. This is what gets lost when the piano goes. Not the music, the continuity, the one thing in the house that had been there for everything, without moving, without commenting, without anything except its specific and absolute fidelity to the corner of the room it occupied. Part 9. The front room without a piano. And what fills it now? A home without a piano is organized differently from one that has one. The piano asked a family to create something together. Today's screens provide endless entertainment, but it almost always comes from somewhere else. Families become audiences instead of participants. A piano filled a room with music made by the people living there. The performances were imperfect, but that was what made them personal. Each song belonged to that family, in that moment, and disappeared when it ended, surviving only in memory. Over time, the piano became more than an instrument. It quietly recorded a family's history simply by being part of everyday life. Those who still gather around one are preserving a tradition that has largely disappeared. Most families did not lose the music when the piano fell silent. They lost the shared space the music created, a place where everyone paused, listened, and spent time together. If your family had a piano, Or if you are the person in your family who still plays one, still keeps one tuned and in use, still sits down on an ordinary Tuesday evening and plays something for no particular reason, tell us about it in the comments. These objects outlast everything, but they need someone to keep playing them. And if this kind of quiet, object-centered history is what you come here for, subscribe. We find one of these every week. The things that were just always there, in the corner of the room, witnessing everything, and never got a story told about them until now.